in painkillers. Joining me now is William Solomon, founder and CEO of Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs. William, thank you so much for giving us some of your time today. And, you know, constantly things are changing. We see everything in the green. But before we start, I'd like to listen to some of what the president had to say last night about these pharmaceutical tariffs.
We're going to tariff our pharmaceuticals. And once we do that, they're going to come rushing back into our country because we're the big market. The advantage we have over everybody is that we're the big market. So we're going to be announcing very shortly a major tariff on pharmaceuticals. And when they hear that, they will leave China, they will leave other places because they have to sell. Most of their product is sold here.
All right. So, William, we heard there from the president last night. What was your reaction to this new announcement that these pharmaceutical tariffs are coming soon?
So as we've seen, there's some short-term volatility. You know, the stocks, obviously, we see there's a lot of volatility there with some of the shares of some of the pharma companies dropping again today with the pause. The markets are rallying. Look, in the end of the day, I think long-term, this is a positive thing for the pharmaceutical industry and for really the country from a national security perspective. Because remember, like you said at the outset, we're relying heavily on China in particular for a lot of our active pharmaceutical ingredients, which are used for a lot of our generic drugs. So think about it. You know, your blood pressure meds, your diabetes meds, your antibiotics, all these active ingredients that are used for these drugs are made in China. So I think, you know, reducing our reliance on countries like China is very, very important, and trying to pressure these big pharma companies to relocate to the U.S. to manufacture here domestically, I think long-term is going to be really important.
You know, William, there's a lot of fear about price increases, especially for the most vulnerable, people who are on fixed incomes, retirees. What do you think could actually happen as far as the actual numbers, you know, both in the short term and then in the long term?
So remember, I think that in terms of the impact of the price, the majority of the impact is going to be felt on these generic drugs, because a lot of those active ingredients are imported out of countries like China. But remember, generic drugs in general are very, very inexpensive. You're talking about pennies on the dollar. Really, where the impact could have been felt would have been a lot of your specialty branded drugs, but that's not really going to be the case in terms of the impact of these tariffs. So is there going to be an increase in price for the average American? Yes, but that increase is going to be a slight increase. It's going to be something that, you know, many people won't even notice. Remember, a lot of your generic drugs, again, pennies on the dollar, they're not that expensive. I think long-term, though, strategically, this makes a lot of sense if you think about it. I think actually the move to increase the tariffs on China is actually a smart move, because look, at the end of the day, remember, the United States is 39% of all consumables, you know, in terms of the world's GDP. We have the strongest economy, and I think ultimately this is going to be a better move to strengthen the U.S. economy long term.
All right. So how soon do you think we could see some actual changes? Because we know the president is really pushing for more American production, but how soon do you think that could happen?
So realistically, I think in terms of having manufacturing plants in the U.S., it's going to take no less than 2 to 3 years to have something that's workable. Because remember, you have to have the workforce, you have to have the technology built out, you have to have the plants, and all that takes a lot of effort, right, and coordination. And you have to actually have investment from the government side. I think that's going to be really important, that if the government wants these big pharma companies to really invest domestically, they're going to have to probably pony up and invest and help them do that, kind of facilitate that process. So it's going to take a few years, but ultimately it's going to be a benefit and a positive for the United States, for Americans, to not have to rely on these countries, because you see what's happening now in this growing trade war with China, it creates a lot of instability potentially. So I think although short term there's going to be some hiccups and there might be some price increases with these generic drugs, long term it's going to be a better play.
All right, last question for you. You know, we hear these announcements of tariffs, and we hear the president, you know, he'll pull back. He has now instituted this 90-day pause on retaliatory tariffs for some countries. What do you think happens next, specifically when it comes to pharmaceutical tariffs?
Well, we know that just last week, the lobbying group for the pharmaceutical industry, Pharma, the trade organization, they asked for the Trump administration to gradually implement these tariffs. So I think potentially that will impact, in a positive way, some of the short-term, maybe negative effects. So maybe we can find some ways to gradually implement that versus kind of doing it in one shot on the pharmaceutical side. That may help to mitigate some of the effects.
All right, we will certainly see what happens. William Solomon, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
After the